I knew this day would come eventually. I've been waiting for it, honestly, preparing for it. For the last 6 years, every decision I made, every dollar I saved, every boundary I reinforced was leading to this exact moment. So when I walked through the door after my shift on Thursday and saw Eugene sitting at his kitchen table with that smug expression and a stack of papers in front of him, I didn't panic. I smiled. Let me back up because you need to understand why I wasn't surprised, why I wasn't scrambling, why I already knew exactly what I was going to do. Eugene has always believed that children are investments, not people, not individuals with their own lives, but investments that should pay dividends. He told me when I was 16 that he and my mom sacrificed everything to raise me, that I owed them for every meal, every piece of clothing, every single thing they'd ever done. He kept a mental tally. Birthday presents counted as loans. Christmas gifts were debts. Taking me to the doctor when I had pneumonia at 12, that was apparently me racking up charges I'd need to repay someday. When I turned 18 and got my first real job at a warehouse, Eugene started dropping hints about how I should contribute more to the household, not reasonable stuff like helping with groceries or utilities. He wanted me to pay him back for raising me. He'd bring it up at dinner, during family gatherings, whenever I achieved anything. Got promoted at 22? He'd say I should be grateful he taught me work ethic and I owed him for that. Bought my first car at 24 with money I'd saved. He told everyone at Thanksgiving that he deserved credit because he drove me to job interviews when I was younger. The breaking point came when I was 23. Eugene sat me down and presented me with an actual itemized bill. I'm not exaggerating. He had a spreadsheet, food costs from age 0 to 18, estimated clothing expenses, school supplies, sports fees, everything. It totaled something like $48,000. He told me this was what I owed him for being born and raised, and he expected monthly payments. When I laughed because I thought he was joking, he got furious. Told me I was an ungrateful brat who didn't appreciate what he'd sacrificed. My mom just sat there saying nothing, like she always did. That's when I decided I was done. Not just done arguing, not just done defending myself, done with Eugene entirely. But I didn't storm out dramatically or cut contact immediately like some people do. No, I did something smarter. I started planning. I moved out within 3 months, got my own apartment across town. I worked extra hours, took a second job for a while, built up my savings. I stopped going to family events unless absolutely necessary, kept conversations surface level, never gave Eugene ammunition, and most importantly, I started watching, listening, paying attention to every entitled thing he said, every manipulative move he made, every time he tried to guilt-trip my younger cousins or other family members. For 6 years, I've been waiting for Eugene to make his big move, because I knew he would. People like him always do. They can't help themselves. They see their adult children doing well, and they think they deserve a piece of it. They think successful kids exist to fund their retirements or pay off their debts or validate their parenting. I knew Eugene was struggling financially because Jackson, his brother, mentioned it a few months ago. Eugene had bought a truck 2 years ago that he couldn't really afford, and the payments were killing him. He'd been complaining to the whole family about it, saying how unfair it was that he had to work so hard at his age. So Thursday evening, I stopped by Eugene's place to drop off some mail that had been sent to my old address. Simple errand. I wasn't expecting drama, but I wasn't surprised when I got it either. The second I walked in, Eugene pointed to the chair across from him like I was being summoned to the principal's office. I sat down, already knowing this was going to be entertaining. He slid the papers across the table, a loan statement from his bank, $16,700 remaining on his truck loan. Then he launched into his speech about how I wasn't a real son, how real sons support their fathers, how it was time I stepped up and showed some appreciation for everything he'd done for me. He actually said I owed him this money for being born. Like my existence was a service he'd provided, and now the bill was due. I looked at the statement, looked at him, and started laughing. I couldn't help it. 6 years of watching this man spiral deeper into his own entitlement. 6 years of preparing for whatever nonsense he'd eventually pull. And he went with this, demanding I pay off his truck loan because I owed him for being born? It was almost too perfect. Eugene's face went red. He stood up and told me that if I didn't agree to pay it, I wasn't his son anymore. I wasn't welcome at Easter, wasn't welcome at any family events, wasn't part of his life. He was cutting me off, disowning me, all because I wouldn't hand over $16,000 to cover his bad financial decisions. I stopped laughing and looked at him. I told him that sounded great, actually. I'd celebrate Easter with my real family instead. The people who actually cared about me as a person and not as a walking ATM. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the door. Eugene was sputtering behind me. saying I'd regret this, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that I'd come crawling back when I realized what I'd lost. I ignored him, but as I was leaving, I stopped at the counter in his kitchen. I'd brought something with me, not because I knew this specific confrontation would happen today, but because I'd been carrying it with me for weeks, waiting for the right moment. The moment when Eugene finally showed his whole family exactly who he was. I pulled the envelope out of my jacket pocket and set it on the counter without saying a word. Eugene was still ranting about respect and obligation and everything else he thought I owed him. I walked out, got in my car, and drove home. Here's where you're probably wondering what was in that envelope. I'm not going to tell you yet because honestly, the suspense is part of what makes this so satisfying. But I will say this. I'd been gathering this particular information for almost 2 years, quietly, carefully, waiting for the exact right moment to use it. Not to hurt Eugene just for the sake of hurting him, but to make absolutely sure that when he tried to manipulate me or guilt me or demand money from me, everyone in our family would see who he really was. No more hiding behind the facade of being a struggling father who deserved support. No more playing the victim. I got home around 8 p.m., made dinner, watched some TV. I wasn't anxious or worried or second-guessing myself. I felt calm, vindicated even. Eugene had finally done exactly what I'd been waiting for him to do, and I'd responded exactly how I'd planned. Everything was falling into place. Friday morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls. 17. 12 from Jackson, 3 from Eugene's number, 2 from my Aunt Louisa. My phone was blowing up with texts too. Jackson's messages were practically incoherent. All caps, barely any punctuation, just, "He opened it. Call me now. This is serious. He's collapsed." I made coffee first. I wasn't going to rush this. I'd waited 6 years for Eugene to face consequences. I could wait another 20 minutes to finish my breakfast. When I finally called Jackson back, he was hysterical. Apparently, Eugene had opened the envelope sometime late Thursday night or early Friday morning. Whatever he found inside destroyed him. Jackson said Eugene was on the floor in his living room, sobbing so hard he couldn't breathe, saying his life was over, everything was ruined, he'd lose everything. Jackson kept yelling at me through the phone, asking what I'd done, what was in that envelope, telling me I needed to come fix this immediately. I told Jackson I had no idea what he was talking about. Eugene had disowned me, remember? Told me I wasn't his son anymore if I didn't pay his truck loan. So whatever was happening at Eugene's house wasn't my problem. I wasn't family anymore. Eugene made that very clear. Jackson lost it. He started screaming about how this wasn't the time for games, how Eugene was having a breakdown, how I needed to be the bigger person and help. The bigger person. That's rich coming from a family that spent decades enabling Eugene's entitled behavior and never once told him he was out of line. My phone has been ringing non-stop since then. Eugene has called me 6 times from his number, but I haven't answered. Jackson keeps texting that Eugene says he'll lose everything if I don't come back and talk to him. My Aunt Louisa left me a voicemail saying I need to answer Eugene for God's sake, that whatever's happening is serious and I'm being cruel by ignoring it. The thing is, I'm not being cruel. I'm being exactly what Eugene taught me to be, transactional. He treated me like an investment that needed to pay off. So now he's learning what happens when investments don't perform the way you expected. He cut me off first. He disowned me first. He told me I wasn't his son. I'm just respecting his wishes. And that envelope? Well, let's just say Eugene spent years building a very specific reputation in our family. The hard-working father who sacrificed everything. The man who deserved respect and support from his ungrateful kids. The victim of a selfish son who wouldn't help him in his time of need. That reputation was everything to him. More important than money. More important than relationships. More important than the truth. So yeah, I'm not answering his calls. I'm not rushing over to comfort him. I'm not being the bigger person. I'm sitting here drinking my coffee, reading through these frantic messages. And for the first time in 6 years, I feel absolutely no guilt about what I've done. Because Eugene wanted to treat fatherhood like a business transaction? Fine, let's see how he handles the audit. Update 1. Okay, so apparently ignoring Eugene's breakdown was the wrong move according to my entire family. Who knew? That's sarcasm, by the way. I knew exactly what would happen. Saturday morning, I woke up to someone pounding on my apartment door at 7 a.m. 7. On a Saturday. I looked through the peephole and there was Jackson, looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days. Behind him was my Aunt Louisa, arms crossed. That disappointed mom expression she's perfected over the years. I seriously considered pretending I wasn't home, but Jackson started yelling through the door that he knew I was in there because my car was in the parking lot. I opened the door. Jackson pushed past me before I could say anything, and Louisa followed him in like they had every right to invade my space at dawn. Jackson immediately started in about how I needed to tell him what was in that envelope, how Eugene had been inconsolable for 36 hours, how the whole family was worried sick. Louisa just stood there, nodding along, throwing in comments about family loyalty and how this wasn't how we handled problems. I told them Eugene handled the problem for me when he disowned me on Thursday. He made it very clear I wasn't his son anymore, so whatever crisis he was having wasn't my responsibility. Did they storm over to Eugene's house at 7 a.m. when he was demanding $16,000 from me? Did they tell him that wasn't how family handled problems? Or was that different because Eugene's the parent and parents can do whatever they want? Jackson actually tried to argue that what Eugene did was understandable because he's struggling financially and I'm doing well. Like that made sense. Like my success meant I owed Eugene money. He kept saying that Eugene raised me, put a roof over my head, fed me for 18 years, and I should be grateful enough to help him out now. The same tired arguments I've been hearing my entire life. I asked Jackson if he remembered the itemized bill, the spreadsheet Eugene showed me 6 years ago where he calculated that I owed him $48,000 for being raised. Jackson got quiet. Louisa shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, they remembered. They thought it was excessive at the time, but they never said anything to Eugene about it. Just like they never say anything when Eugene pulls this stuff with anyone else in the family. Louisa tried a different approach. She started talking about how Eugene was from a different generation, how he didn't understand that you can't expect children to pay you back for raising them, how he made mistakes, but he still loved me. She said Eugene was genuinely devastated by whatever was in that envelope, that he'd been crying non-stop, that he kept saying his life was ruined and everything was over. She asked me what could possibly be so bad that it would destroy him like this. I told her to ask Eugene. If he wanted people to know what was in the envelope, he could tell them himself. It wasn't my job to explain Eugene's breakdown when I didn't even know what specifically triggered it. Sure, I knew what information was in the envelope, but I didn't know which part made him collapse or why he thought his life was over. That was between Eugene and his conscience. Jackson exploded at that, started yelling about how I was playing games, how I clearly did something to hurt Eugene on purpose, how I was being vindictive and cruel. He said I should be ashamed of myself for kicking a man when he's down, that Eugene was family, and family doesn't do this to each other. The irony of him saying that while completely ignoring everything Eugene had done to me was almost funny. I asked Jackson if he'd be willing to pay $16,000 because someone told him he owed them money for existing. Would he just hand over his savings because Eugene decided that raising him required financial compensation? Jackson stammered something about that being different, about how Eugene was asking me specifically because I could afford it, about how it was only fair that successful children help their struggling parents. That's when I realized nothing I said was going to matter. Jackson and Louisa had already decided Eugene was the victim here, and I was the villain. They weren't there to understand my side or acknowledge that Eugene demanding money and then disowning me was completely unacceptable. They were there to pressure me into fixing whatever I'd broken, to make me feel guilty enough to cave and go apologize to Eugene. So I told them to leave. Jackson tried to keep arguing, but I opened my apartment door and stood there waiting. Louisa gave me this long, disappointed look and said I was making a mistake. That family was more important than pride, that I'd regret this when Eugene was gone, and it was too late to make things right. Then she left. Jackson stood there for another minute trying to stare me down before finally walking out. The door hadn't even closed before my phone started ringing. Eugene. I declined it. He called back immediately. I declined again. Then Jackson was calling, probably from his car in my parking lot. I turned my phone on silent and went to make breakfast. But here's where things got really interesting. Around noon, my mom called. My mom, who hadn't said a single word during Eugene's demand for money on Thursday, who sat there silent while Eugene told me I wasn't his son anymore, who never once in 29 years stood up to Eugene when he pulled his entitled parent routine. She was calling me now, and honestly, I was curious what she'd say. I answered. Mom immediately started talking about how Eugene was in a bad state, how she was worried about him, how the whole family was falling apart over this. She didn't ask how I was doing, didn't acknowledge that Eugene had treated me horribly, just jumped straight to poor Eugene and his suffering. I asked her why she never said anything on Thursday, why she sat there while Eugene demanded money and disowned me, why she'd spent my entire life enabling this behavior instead of telling Eugene he was wrong. Mom got defensive. She said it wasn't her place to interfere between Eugene and me, that she couldn't control what Eugene did, that I knew how he was and I should have just handled it better. Handled it better. Like there's a good way to handle your father demanding $16,000 and disowning you when you refuse. I asked her directly if she thought Eugene was right to demand that money, if she thought I owed him $16,000 for being born and raised. There was this long pause, and then Mom said that Eugene had provided for me and he deserved respect for that, and maybe helping him financially would show that respect. So she agreed with him. Maybe not with the exact demand, but with the underlying belief that I owed Eugene something for raising me, that my success meant I had an obligation to bail him out of his bad financial decisions. She'd just been quiet about it because she didn't want to be the bad guy. But she absolutely supported Eugene's position. I told Mom that she and Eugene could figure this out together then, since they were on the same team. She started crying, saying I was tearing the family apart, that this wasn't who I was, that she'd raised me better than this. I almost laughed. She'd raised me to be exactly this, someone who eventually gets tired of being treated like a financial resource and pushes back. Then Mom dropped what she probably thought was a bomb. She said Eugene had been planning to ask me for money for months, that he'd been talking about it constantly, that he truly believed I owed it to him. She said the truck loan wasn't even the real problem. Eugene had other debts too. Medical bills from last year, credit card balances he'd been carrying. The $16,000 was just the start. Eugene had apparently been planning to present me with a whole plan for how I could help support him financially going forward. A plan. Eugene had a whole plan for how his adult son was going to become his personal bank account. And Mom had known about this for months and never once thought to warn me or tell Eugene this was insane. I asked Mom if she knew what was in the envelope. She said no, Eugene wouldn't tell her. He just kept saying I'd destroyed everything, that the family would never forgive him, that there was no coming back from this. Mom said she needed to know what I'd done so she could help fix it. I told her I hadn't done anything except give Eugene information he'd apparently been hiding from everyone. If he was devastated by the truth coming out, that said a lot more about him than it did about me. Mom started asking what information, what truth, but I ended the call. The rest of Saturday was quiet. No more visitors. Just texts from various family members, Jackson, Louisa, Mom, even my cousin Violet, who I barely talked to, all saying variations of the same thing. Whatever was happening with Eugene was serious. I needed to be the bigger person. Family comes first, stop being stubborn. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody acknowledged that Eugene had treated me like garbage. Nobody seemed to care that I'd been dealing with Eugene's entitled behavior for literally my entire life. And this was just the culmination of decades of emotional manipulation. Sunday morning brought a new development. Jackson showed up at my apartment again, but this time he had Eugene with him. I saw them through the peephole. Eugene looking absolutely wrecked. Red eyes, rumpled clothes, the whole 9 yards. Jackson was propping him up like Eugene could barely walk on his own. They knocked. I didn't answer. They knocked again. Eugene started talking through the door. He said he knew I was home, knew I was ignoring him, but he needed to talk to me. His voice was shaking. He said what I'd given him in that envelope was going to destroy his relationships with everyone, that I'd made him look terrible, that the family would turn on him if they found out. He begged me to come out and talk to him, to work something out, to find a solution that didn't involve exposing him. Exposing him. Interesting choice of words. Like I'd uncovered some secret instead of just revealing something Eugene had been hiding. Something he'd been lying about, apparently. Jackson chimed in through the door too, saying they weren't leaving until I talked to them, that we could stand out here all day if necessary. So I opened the door. Eugene looked worse up close. He'd clearly been crying a lot, and he looked exhausted. He immediately started apologizing, saying he shouldn't have demanded money, shouldn't have disowned me, that he'd overreacted and made a mistake. He said he'd been stressed about his finances and took it out on me in the worst way possible. I just stared at him. This was the same man who 48 hours ago told me I wasn't his son, who said I owed him $16,000 for being born, who had spent years making me feel guilty for existing. And now he was apologizing, but only because I'd apparently exposed something that could hurt him even more than losing his son did. Eugene kept talking. He said he understood if I was angry, that he deserved my anger, but he needed that envelope back, or he needed me to promise not to share what was inside it. He said if the information got out to the whole family, it would ruin him. People would look at him differently. They'd question everything. He'd lose their respect. And there it was. Eugene wasn't sorry for how he treated me. He was sorry that his treatment of me had led to consequences he couldn't control. He was scared of what I knew, scared of what I could do with that information. The apology wasn't real. It was damage control. Jackson was watching this whole exchange, clearly confused about what was in the envelope, but smart enough to realize it was something big. He started trying to mediate, saying, we could work this out, that maybe I could return the envelope and we could all move forward. That family fights shouldn't escalate to this level. I asked Eugene directly what he thought would happen if the family found out what was in that envelope. What specifically was he scared of? Eugene's face went pale. He said I knew exactly what would happen, that I'd put that envelope together specifically to ruin him, that I'd been planning this for years, just waiting for an opportunity to use it. He wasn't wrong about that. I had been planning. I had been waiting. And watching Eugene realize that I'd been 3 steps ahead of him this whole time was incredibly satisfying. But I told Eugene I hadn't decided what to do with the information yet. I hadn't told anyone else in the family. The envelope was just between us for now. What happened next depended entirely on what Eugene did next. Eugene grabbed onto that like a lifeline. He asked what I wanted, what it would take for me to keep quiet. Money? Did I want him to apologize publicly? Did I want him to leave me alone forever? Whatever I wanted, he'd do it. Just please don't tell the family what was in that envelope. Jackson was getting more agitated, demanding to know what we were talking about. What information was so damaging that Eugene was begging like this? I told Jackson that if Eugene wanted him to know, Eugene could tell him himself. This was Eugene's secret to share or keep. Eugene shot me this desperate look, pleading with me not to say anything more. And right then, standing in my doorway watching my father beg me to protect his reputation after years of him destroying mine, I realized something. The envelope wasn't just revenge, it was leverage, and I could use it however I wanted. I told Eugene and Jackson to leave. I needed time to think about what came next. Eugene started panicking, saying he couldn't just leave things like this, that he needed assurance I wouldn't tell anyone. I said he should have thought about that before demanding $16,000 and disowning me. Then, I closed the door in both their faces. My phone's been going crazy since then. Eugene's called 20 times. Jackson's texted me probably 50 messages trying to figure out what's going on. Mom called asking if I'd talked to Eugene, saying he came home in even worse shape than before. And honestly, I'm enjoying this. Is that petty? Maybe. But after 29 years of being treated like an investment portfolio instead of a son, watching Eugene panic about his precious reputation feels like justice. The question now is, what do I actually do with this information? Because yeah, I could tell the family, I could blow up Eugene's whole world. But there might be something better. Something that makes him understand exactly what it feels like to owe someone something you can never repay. I've got time to figure it out. Meanwhile, Eugene's the one who can't sleep, can't eat, can't stop panicking about what comes next. Funny how that works. Update 2. So Monday happened, and it was a doozy. Shout out to everyone who said Eugene wouldn't let this go quietly. You were absolutely right. The man is incapable of accepting consequences without trying to manipulate his way out of them first. Monday morning, I got a text from Louisa saying there was going to be a family meeting at Eugene's house that evening at 6 p.m., not asking if I could attend, not requesting my presence, just informing me that this meeting was happening and I was expected to be there. The text said this was about resolving family issues and moving forward in a healthy way. Sure, because nothing says healthy family dynamics like demanding someone show up to a meeting where they're probably going to get ganged up on. I didn't respond to Louisa's text. I had work, I had errands to run, and I definitely wasn't interested in sitting in Eugene's living room while he orchestrated some intervention designed to pressure me into giving back the envelope. But around noon, my phone started blowing up with messages from different family members. Violet, Jackson, even my mom, all saying I needed to come to this meeting, that it was important, that we needed to talk as a family. The thing that got me was Mom's message. She said Eugene had something important to tell everyone, that he was finally going to be honest about some things, and my presence was crucial. Eugene being honest? That was new. So I texted back and said fine, I'd be there. Not because I cared about Eugene's feelings or wanted to reconcile. I was curious what kind of performance he was planning to put on. I showed up at Eugene's house at 6:15. Yeah, I was late on purpose. When I walked in, the whole family was already there. Jackson and his wife Aileen sitting on the couch, Louisa in the armchair, Mom in the kitchen doorway, Violet standing by the window, and Eugene in the middle of it all, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 4 days. Eugene started talking before I even sat down. He said he'd called everyone together because there were things he needed to address, mistakes he'd made, and he wanted to clear the air with the whole family present. He apologized for how he'd handled things with me on Thursday, admitted that demanding I pay his truck loan was wrong, said he'd been stressed about money and took it out on me unfairly. Everyone was nodding along, like this was exactly what they'd expected and wanted to hear. Eugene, the contrite father, admitting his mistakes, asking for forgiveness. Classic Eugene move. Make a big public apology so everyone else pressures the wronged person to accept it and move on. But then Eugene said something that made me realize why he'd really called this meeting. He said that while he'd made mistakes, I'd also made mistakes in how I responded. That leaving him that envelope was vindictive and cruel. That threatening to expose private family matters was taking things too far. That we both needed to apologize to each other and commit to handling disagreements better in the future. There it was. Eugene was trying to reframe this whole situation as a mutual conflict where we were both wrong, both needed to apologize, Both needed to compromise. He was trying to make me look equally guilty in front of the family so they'd pressure me to back down. I asked Eugene what exactly I'd done that required an apology. He stumbled over his words, saying that I knew what I'd done, that the envelope was designed to hurt him, that I deliberately tried to damage his reputation with the family. Louisa jumped in saying that whatever was in the envelope, using it as a weapon, was wrong. That family doesn't threaten family, so I asked if family demands money from family, if family disowns family, if family spends decades making their children feel like financial burdens who owe repayment for being raised. Because Eugene had done all of that, but apparently that wasn't threatening or weaponizing or wrong. That was just Eugene being Eugene, and everyone had spent years excusing it. Mom tried to interrupt, saying, "We weren't there to rehash old arguments, that we needed to focus on moving forward." But Jackson actually spoke up and said, "No, maybe we did need to talk about this." He looked at Eugene and asked if it was true that Eugene had shown me an itemized bill years ago, demanding payment for raising me. Eugene's face went red. He said that was taken out of context, that he'd been trying to teach me about the value of money and the sacrifices parents make, that it was a lesson, not a real demand, which was complete garbage, and everyone in that room who knew Eugene could tell. Violet, who'd been quiet up until then, said she remembered Eugene making similar comments to her when she graduated college, about how she owed him and Mom for her education, how successful kids had a responsibility to help their parents. She said she'd always felt uncomfortable about it, but thought that was just how Eugene expressed love. Louisa started getting defensive, saying parents did deserve respect and appreciation, that there was nothing wrong with expecting adult children to help out when they were capable. But Aileen, Jackson's wife, cut in and said there was a difference between helping family and being told you owe them for existing. She looked at Eugene and asked him directly if he actually believed his children owed him money for being raised. Eugene was scrambling now. He said everyone was misunderstanding him, that he'd never expected literal repayment, that he just wanted his kids to appreciate what he'd done for them. But I pulled out my phone and asked if he wanted me to show everyone the spreadsheet he'd made, the one with line items and dollar amounts and a total at the bottom. The actual bill he'd presented to me 6 years ago. The room went silent. Eugene looked panicked. He said I was making it sound worse than it was, that I was twisting things to make him look bad. But Jackson asked him straight out if he'd actually made a spreadsheet calculating what I owed him. Eugene tried to deflect, saying it was years ago, saying he'd been in a different headspace, saying everyone makes mistakes. Mom finally spoke up. She said Eugene had shown her that spreadsheet before showing it to me, that she'd told him it was a bad idea, that he was going to push me away, but he'd insisted that I needed to understand the financial reality of raising children. She said she'd hoped we could all move past it, but clearly that hadn't happened. So Mom had known. She'd known Eugene was planning to present me with a bill for being raised, had told him it was a bad idea, and then sat there silently when he did it anyway. And she'd never once mentioned this to anyone else in the family. She'd just let Eugene's behavior continue unchecked for 6 more years. Jackson looked genuinely shocked. Aileen looked disgusted. Violet was staring at Eugene like she was seeing him for the first time. Louisa was trying to come up with some defense but couldn't seem to find the words. Eugene realized he was losing control of the narrative. He said fine, yes, he'd made that spreadsheet. Yes, he'd had unrealistic expectations, but that was in the past and he'd apologized. What mattered now was what I'd done in response. He said the envelope I'd left him contained information that could destroy his relationships with everyone in this room, that I was holding it over his head like blackmail, that I was being just as manipulative as he'd ever been. I told Eugene the envelope didn't contain opinions or accusations. It contained facts, documented facts about things he'd done. If those facts would destroy his relationships, that said everything about what he'd been hiding, not about me for discovering it. Jackson demanded to know what was in the envelope. Eugene immediately said that wasn't important, that the contents didn't matter, that this was about the principle of threatening family with exposure. But Jackson kept pushing, saying if it was just facts, then Eugene should have no problem with everyone knowing them. Eugene's face went pale again. He looked at me with this desperate, pleading expression and said we didn't need to do this, that airing everything out would only hurt people, that some things were better left private. Which was fascinating because Eugene had never cared about privacy when he was publicly humiliating me at family gatherings by bringing up how much I owed him. Louisa tried to mediate, saying maybe both Eugene and I should agree not to discuss the envelope contents, that we could move forward without dredging up whatever it contained. But Violet said no. She wanted to know what Eugene was so afraid of everyone finding out. If Eugene had been demanding money and disowning people over debts, what else had he been doing that he needed to keep secret? That question hung in the air. Eugene was visibly panicking now. looking around the room for support but finding none. Everyone was watching him, waiting for an answer, and he had nothing. His carefully planned family meeting where he was supposed to make me look like the bad guy had completely fallen apart. Eugene finally said that the envelope contained personal information about financial decisions he'd made, mistakes that only affected him, things that were embarrassing but not illegal or harmful to anyone else. He said I was using his embarrassment as leverage to punish him for asking me for money, and that was wrong, regardless of what he'd done first. I asked Eugene if he wanted to know what was interesting about the information in that envelope. He looked terrified but didn't respond. I said the interesting thing was that I'd spent almost 2 years gathering it, quietly going through old documents, talking to people, piecing together a timeline, that I'd known eventually Eugene would demand something from me, would push too far, and I'd need proof of exactly who he was so the family couldn't pretend anymore. Mom asked what I meant by proof. I said Eugene had spent decades building a reputation as the hard-working father who'd sacrificed everything for his kids, the man who deserved respect and support. But that reputation was built on a very specific narrative about his choices and his character. The envelope contained evidence that the narrative wasn't accurate. Eugene stood up and said this was exactly what he was talking about, that I was threatening him, that I was going to ruin his reputation over one mistake. But Jackson stood up too and said if Eugene had nothing to hide, then what was the problem with everyone knowing the truth? That's when things got really heated. Eugene started yelling at Jackson, saying he didn't understand what he was asking for, that some information doesn't need to be public, that Jackson should be supporting his father instead of questioning him. Jackson yelled back that he was tired of being told to support Eugene without question, that maybe Eugene needed to earn that support by being honest for once. Louisa tried to calm everyone down, but Eugene was raging now. He turned on me and said I'd orchestrated this whole thing, that I'd planned from the beginning to turn the family against him, that I was manipulating everyone into thinking he was some kind of monster. He said I was cold and calculating, and I'd been waiting years for an opportunity to destroy him. I told Eugene he was right about one thing. I had been waiting years. Because people like him never stop on their own. They keep pushing boundaries, keep taking more, keep demanding more, until someone finally pushes back hard enough to make them stop. The envelope was me pushing back. What happened next was entirely up to him. Eugene asked what I wanted. If I wanted him to beg, to humiliate himself, to admit to everyone that he'd been wrong about everything. He said name it, and he'd do it. Just please don't show anyone what was in that envelope. But before I could answer, Aileen spoke up. She said she'd been quiet this whole time because this wasn't her family, but she couldn't stay silent anymore. She looked at Eugene and said that watching him beg to keep secrets instead of just being honest made her think whatever was in that envelope was really bad. Bad enough that Eugene was more terrified of the truth than he was of losing his son. Aileen asked me directly what was in the envelope, and I looked at Eugene, watched him realize he'd backed himself into a corner, watched him understand that his desperation had made everyone more suspicious instead of more sympathetic. I said the envelope contained proof of something Eugene had been lying about for over a decade, something that affected how the family viewed him, how they understood his choices, and why he'd always been so obsessed with money and debt and children owing their parents. I said it explained a lot about why Eugene was the way he was, and once people knew, they wouldn't be able to look at him the same way. Eugene was shaking. He said I was exaggerating, that I was making it sound worse than it was, that people would understand once they heard his side. But his voice was weak. He knew I had him. Jackson said he wanted to hear Eugene's side then, wanted to know what this was all about. Eugene looked around the room at all of us and said he couldn't, that some things were too personal, that he had a right to privacy. Louisa actually agreed, saying that even if Eugene had made mistakes, he didn't owe everyone an explanation about every aspect of his life. But Violet said that was the problem. Eugene had spent years making everyone feel like they owed him money, respect, gratitude, but he didn't think he owed anyone honesty or accountability. That wasn't how families worked. Mom tried one more time to stop this. She said we all needed to take a break, cool down, approach this differently. She said fighting wasn't going to solve anything, but I told her fighting was exactly what solved this, because years of silence and accommodation had only made Eugene worse. The meeting broke up shortly after that. Nobody was speaking to each other. Jackson and Aileen left without saying goodbye to Eugene. Violet told me she wanted to talk later, that she had questions. Louisa looked frustrated and confused. Mom looked exhausted. Eugene stayed slumped in his chair, staring at the floor. As I was leaving, he said my name, just once, quietly. I turned and looked at him. He said he knew I was enjoying this, watching him panic, but that eventually I'd have to make a choice about whether destroying him was worth it. I told Eugene I'd already made my choice 6 years ago, when he presented me with that spreadsheet. Everything since then had just been waiting for the right moment. Then I left. My phone's been buzzing non-stop since I got home. Jackson's been texting, asking me to explain what's really going on. Violet wants to meet for coffee. Aileen sent a message saying she believes me. Whatever this is about. Even Mom called to say I'd gone too far. That humiliating Eugene in front of everyone was cruel. But here's what nobody seems to get. I haven't exposed anything yet. I haven't told anyone what's in the envelope. Eugene's humiliation is self-inflicted. His panic, his desperation, his inability to just be honest is what's destroying his reputation, not me. And I'm realizing that's the real revenge, not revealing the information. Making Eugene destroy himself trying to hide it. Watching him realize that the more he fights to protect his reputation, the more suspicious everyone becomes. The more he begs and manipulates and lies, the less anyone trusts him. The question is how much longer I let him suffer before I finally show everyone what he's been hiding. Part of me wants to drag this out, watch him spiral, but another part of me knows the real satisfaction will come when the truth finally comes out and Eugene has to face what he's done. Either way, Eugene's learning exactly what I learned 6 years ago. Sometimes the debt you owe can't be paid in money. Final update. All right, here we go. The moment everyone's been waiting for. What was in that envelope that made Eugene collapse and beg me to keep quiet for a week straight? Buckle up. Because the irony of this situation is absolutely chef's kiss perfect. Tuesday morning, I woke up to a text from Violet asking if we could meet. She said she'd been thinking about everything from the family meeting, about Eugene's panic and desperation, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Eugene was hiding explained a lot about our family dynamics. She wanted to know the truth, and she promised she wouldn't tell anyone if I asked her not to. I met Violet at a diner near my place around 10 a.m. She looked exhausted, said she'd barely slept since Monday's meeting. She asked me directly what was in the envelope, said she deserved to know since Eugene's behavior had affected her too over the years with all his comments about owing parents and needing to show appreciation through financial support. So I told her. And watching her face go through confusion, then shock, then absolute fury was honestly therapeutic. The envelope contained 2 years' worth of research into Eugene's own financial history with his parents. My grandparents, who died when I was 19 and Violet was 17. I'd gone through old family documents, talked to relatives who remembered, pulled bank records where I could access them, pieced together a timeline of exactly how much support Eugene received from his parents throughout his adult life. Turns out Eugene's whole self-made hardworking father persona was complete fiction. His parents, my grandparents, had bankrolled significant portions of his life. When Eugene was 25 and wanted to buy his first house, his parents gave him $15,000 for the down payment. Not loaned. Gave. When Eugene lost his job when I was 3 years old, his parents paid his mortgage for 7 months while he found new work. When Eugene wanted to start a small side business in his 30s that failed within a year, his parents covered the startup costs and never asked to be repaid. I had copies of checks, bank statements showing transfers, even letters my grandfather had written to other family members talking about helping Eugene financially. Over the course of Eugene's adult life, his parents had given or loaned him somewhere around $73,000, and Eugene had repaid maybe $8,000 of it before his dad died. But here's where it gets really twisted. When my grandfather got sick with cancer about 12 years ago, he and my grandmother burned through their savings on medical bills. They'd helped so many people over the years, including Eugene, that they didn't have much left. My grandmother reached out to Eugene asking if he could help them with some expenses, not even asking for repayment of the money they'd given him, just asking for help now that they needed it. Eugene gave them $300 once, then told them he couldn't afford to help because he had his own family to support, his own bills to pay. He said they should have been better with their money instead of giving it all away to people who didn't appreciate it. My grandfather died thinking his son resented him for asking for help after spending decades supporting that same son financially. After my grandfather died, my grandmother lived another 4 years. She struggled, had to sell their house and move into a tiny apartment, had to work part-time at 71 years old because she couldn't make ends meet. Eugene visited her maybe twice a year and never offered financial support. When she died, Eugene was at the funeral talking about what a wonderful mother she'd been, how she'd taught him the value of hard work and sacrifice. The envelope contained all of this. Every check his parents had written him, every time they'd bailed him out, every time he'd promised to pay them back and never did. And copies of emails between my grandmother and Louisa where my grandmother talked about being hurt that Eugene wouldn't help her after everything she'd done for him. Violet was crying by the time I finished explaining. She said she remembered our grandmother struggling, remembered her wearing the same worn-out clothes and living in that cramped apartment. But she'd been a teenager and hadn't understood why. She'd assumed our grandparents had just been bad with money. Eugene had specifically told everyone that story, that his parents had been generous but financially irresponsible, that he'd tried to help them but they'd made too many mistakes. Eugene had rewritten the narrative to make himself look responsible and his parents look foolish. And everyone believed him because why would he lie about his own parents? Violet asked why Eugene was so obsessed with debt and children owing their parents if he'd never paid back his own parents. I said that was exactly the point. Eugene knew what he'd done. He knew he'd taken advantage of his parents' generosity and then abandoned them when they needed him. The guilt and shame of that made him project onto his own kids. By demanding we pay him back, by insisting children owed their parents, he was trying to retroactively justify his own behavior. If he could make us do what he never did, somehow that made him less of a hypocrite. Violet said we had to tell Jackson. Had to tell everyone. They all deserved to know that Eugene's entire moral framework about family obligation was based on him being the exact kind of ungrateful child he'd always accused me of being. Wednesday evening, Violet and I went to Jackson's house. Aileen was there too. We showed them everything, the checks, the bank statements, the emails, the timeline of Eugene taking money from his parents and then refusing to help them. Jackson was quiet for a long time after we finished. Then he asked why Eugene would do this, why he would take so much and give back so little. I said because Eugene is fundamentally selfish. He views relationships as transactional, but only when the transaction benefits him. His parents giving him money was them fulfilling their obligation as parents. Him giving them money when they needed it would have been him being taken advantage of. In Eugene's mind, the flow of resources only goes one direction, toward him. Aileen said this explains so much about Eugene's behavior over the years. All the guilt trips about not appreciating him, all the demands for respect and gratitude, all the insistence that successful children should support their parents. He was describing what he wished he'd done for his own parents, but he was too much of a coward to admit he'd failed them. Jackson wanted to confront Eugene immediately, wanted to show up at his house with all the evidence and demand an explanation, but I told him to wait. I had a better plan. Thursday afternoon, I sent a message to the whole family group chat. Eugene, Mom, Jackson, Louisa, Violet, Aileen. I said I was going to be at Eugene's house at 6 p.m. and I was bringing the envelope. Anyone who wanted to know what was inside should be there. Eugene immediately called me. His voice was panicked, desperate. He said we could work this out privately, that I didn't need to involve everyone, that he'd do whatever I wanted, just please, don't show them the envelope. I told Eugene he'd had a week to come clean on his own. He'd chosen to lie and manipulate instead. Now everyone would see who he really was. 6 p.m. Thursday, I pulled up to Eugene's house. Jackson's car was already there, so was Louisa's, Violet's, even Mom's, though I hadn't been sure she'd come. Everyone was gathered in the living room when I walked in. Eugene looked terrible. He'd clearly been crying. Mom was sitting next to him holding his hand. I put the envelope on the coffee table, told everyone that inside was documentation of Eugene's financial relationship with his parents. Proof that Eugene had received over $70,000 in support from them throughout his adult life and repaid less than $8,000. Proof that when his parents needed help in their old age, Eugene refused them. Proof that Eugene abandoned his own mother while she struggled financially, then lied to the family about why she was struggling. Eugene tried to interrupt, saying I was twisting things, that it wasn't that simple, but I opened the envelope and started laying out documents. Checks from my grandfather to Eugene with house down payment in the memo line. Bank statements showing transfers during the period Eugene was unemployed. Letters where my grandfather talked about wanting to help his son succeed. Then I laid out the emails from my grandmother to Louisa, the ones where she talked about asking Eugene for help and being turned down, where she said she didn't understand why Eugene was so cold to her when she'd only ever tried to support him, where she said she was hurt and confused and didn't know what she'd done wrong. Louisa's face went pale reading those emails. She said she'd had no idea Eugene had refused to help, that my grandmother had asked her not to tell anyone because she didn't want to create family drama. She'd assumed Eugene didn't know how bad things were financially for my grandmother. I pulled out another document, a copy of a letter Eugene had sent to my grandmother 6 months before she died. In it, Eugene told her he couldn't keep hearing about her money problems, that she'd made her choices in life and now had to live with them, that he had his own family to worry about and couldn't be her safety net. He actually used the phrase safety net when talking about his dying mother who'd given him tens of thousands of dollars over the years. Mom was crying. Jackson was staring at Eugene with this expression of complete disgust. Violet was shaking her head. Aileen looked furious. Louisa just looked broken. Eugene finally spoke. He said yes, his parents had helped him financially over the years, but that was what parents did. They were supposed to support their children. He said he'd always intended to pay them back, but life got expensive and he had his own kids to raise. He said when his mother asked for help, he genuinely couldn't afford it because his own finances were tight. I asked Eugene if his finances were too tight to buy a new truck 2 years ago, too tight to take that vacation to Florida last year, too tight to spend money at bars every weekend. But somehow, he'd expected me to hand over $16,000 because I owed him for being raised. Jackson asked Eugene how he could demand money from me while knowing he'd never paid back his own parents. Eugene said it was different because he'd actually struggled to raise us, actually sacrificed things, actually deserved compensation for his effort, unlike his parents, who Eugene claimed had it easy financially and didn't really need the money anyway. Violet exploded at that. Said our grandmother was working at 71 years old, was living in an apartment that barely fit her furniture, was skipping meals to save money. But Eugene decided she didn't really need help because acknowledging her struggle would mean acknowledging his own failure. Eugene started getting defensive, saying we didn't understand what it was like being responsible for children, what it cost him financially and emotionally to raise us, that his parents had helped him because they could afford to, but when his mother needed help, it wasn't his fault he couldn't provide it. Louisa asked Eugene directly if he'd told his mother he couldn't afford to help her, or if he'd told her she didn't deserve help because she'd been irresponsible. Eugene went quiet. Louisa said she remembered now. Remembered Eugene making comments over the years about his parents being too generous, giving money to people who didn't appreciate it. She'd thought he was speaking generally. Now she realized he was justifying his own refusal to help them. Mom finally spoke up. She said she'd known some of this, known that Eugene's parents had helped them financially and that Eugene hadn't paid them back. But she didn't know Eugene had refused to help his mother when she was struggling. She said she'd assumed Eugene had done what he could, that money had just been too tight. Eugene looked at her and said it had been too tight, that he'd made the responsible choice prioritizing his immediate family. I asked Mom if she agreed with that choice now, knowing that Eugene currently expected me to prioritize him financially over my own future, expected me to pay his debts because children owed their parents. She didn't answer. Jackson said he couldn't believe this was who Eugene really was. Someone who took and took from his parents, then turned his back on them when they needed him, then had the audacity to demand his own children pay him back for raising them. He said Eugene was a hypocrite and a liar, and he didn't want anything to do with him anymore. Eugene started yelling at Jackson, saying he was ungrateful, that Jackson didn't understand what Eugene had been through, what he'd sacrificed. But Jackson just laughed, asked what exactly Eugene had sacrificed that his own parents hadn't sacrificed for him. What made Eugene so special that he deserved support but didn't have to give it? Eugene said he'd made mistakes with his parents, but that didn't erase everything he'd done for his own kids, that he still deserved respect and appreciation, that we were all turning on him over something that happened years ago instead of focusing on the present. I told Eugene the present was him demanding $16,000 from me and disowning me when I refused. The present was him lying to everyone about being a self-made man when he'd been bankrolled by his parents. The present was him claiming children owed their parents when he'd never paid his own debt. Violet said she'd thought about Eugene's demands for money differently now. It wasn't just entitled behavior, it was Eugene trying to extract from us what he'd taken from his parents, trying to close some moral balance sheet where, if his kids paid him, somehow that retroactively justified him never paying his own parents. Eugene broke down crying then, said he knew he'd failed his parents, knew he should have helped them, but he'd been scared about his own financial situation and convinced himself they'd be fine. By the time he realized how bad things were for his mother, he was too ashamed to admit he'd been wrong. So he'd kept up the lie that she was financially irresponsible, and the guilt of that had eaten at him for years. He said that's why he'd made the spreadsheet demanding I pay him back, why he'd convinced himself I owed him. If he could get me to do what he'd never done, if he could prove that children should support their parents, somehow that made him less of a failure, made him feel like maybe his parents would have understood. Mom was still crying. Louisa looked devastated. Jackson just looked angry. Aileen was comforting Violet, who was also crying now. Eugene looked at me and asked if I was satisfied. If destroying him in front of everyone, exposing his worst failure, making him admit what kind of son he'd been, if that was enough revenge for me. I told Eugene this wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. He'd spent decades lying to himself and everyone else about who he was and what he deserved. Someone needed to stop him. Louisa said she needed time to process this, that she'd been enabling Eugene's behavior for years without realizing what it stemmed from. She got up and left. Violet followed her. Jackson told Eugene he didn't want to see him or talk to him until Eugene got serious help dealing with his issues. He and Aileen left too. That left me, Eugene, and Mom. Mom looked at Eugene and said she wished he'd told her the full story about his parents years ago. That if she'd known how much guilt he was carrying, she would have pushed him to deal with it instead of projecting it onto his kids. Eugene said he was sorry, that he'd made mistakes, that he wanted to do better. I told Eugene that wanting to do better and actually doing better were different things. That if he was serious, he'd start by stopping all the demands for money from his kids, all the guilt trips about owing him, all the manipulation around family obligation. Eugene said he would, that he'd stop, that he just wanted his family back. Mom looked at me and asked if I could forgive Eugene eventually, if we could move forward from this. I told her I didn't know, that Eugene had caused me a lot of damage over the years with his entitled behavior, that even knowing why he did it didn't erase the harm. She nodded like she understood. I left after that, drove home, turned my phone off for the night because I knew it would be blowing up with messages. Friday morning, I woke up to texts from Jackson saying he'd been thinking about everything, that he appreciated me exposing the truth even though it was painful. Violet sent a message saying she was angry at Eugene but also sad for him, that what he'd done to his parents was terrible, but his guilt had clearly destroyed him. Louisa texted saying she needed space from Eugene for a while to sort out her feelings. Mom called and asked if I'd come by to talk. I went over Friday afternoon. She said Eugene was genuinely broken over this, that he'd admitted things to her that morning he'd never admitted before about how ashamed he'd been of failing his parents and how that shame had poisoned his relationship with his own kids. I told Mom that Eugene's shame wasn't my problem to fix, that I was glad he was finally being honest, but that didn't obligate me to forgive him or maintain a relationship with him. Mom said she understood but hoped I'd keep the door open for the future. It's been a few days now. Eugene hasn't contacted me at all. Jackson says Eugene is apparently talking about going to therapy, actually dealing with his issues instead of projecting them onto everyone else. Violet says the family dynamic has shifted completely, that people are being more honest about Eugene's behavior and not just accepting it anymore. As for me, I feel lighter. 6 years of waiting for this moment, 2 years of gathering evidence, a week of watching Eugene panic and scramble and beg, all of it led to him finally facing the truth about himself. Whether he actually changes or not isn't my concern. I got what I needed. Eugene wanted to treat fatherhood like a transaction where I owed him for existing. Turns out he'd been running that transaction in reverse his whole life, taking from his parents and never paying back the debt he claimed I owed him. He owed it first. And unlike him, I'm not interested in collecting. I'm done carrying Eugene's guilt. Done being his emotional punching bag. Done letting him weaponize family obligation. He disowned me. I'm just accepting that decision and moving forward without him. And honestly, I've never felt freer.